Namaste dear students. In this video, we will discuss the topic of preventing war and stopping terrorism. In the study of international relations, the study of war is of vital importance. The rise of realism inside the domain of the academic discipline of IR has completely focused on or extensively focused on the question of war and how to prevent it. It will be a blunder to consider that realists were warmonger and liberals were in favor of preventing the war. It's not like that. Both realists and liberals, they wanted to prevent war, but their ways were different. The phenomena of war had been a driving force in the shaping of the academic discourse of the IR. It is not just to imagine or expect peace to happen or to take place without any kind of endeavor. So it's very important, according to realists and by the liberals, that you have to do something in order to make peace a reality. And that is why you need to prevent war. Liberals, on one hand, they argue that there are some international fora that is to be established in order to prevent war, while realists, they argue that this is the state that need to take care to prevent war. Even the harshest or even the staunch supporter of realism, like Chanakya, they were not in favor of any kind of war. They wanted war to be prevented. Rather, threats or skirmishes are okay, but full-fledged war or Prakasha Yuddha, as Chanakya called it, that is to be prevented under any circumstances. We'll move on with these two major ideas on war and how to prevent it, and we'll try to understand how liberals and realists, they have attempted or they have inquired how this war can be prevented. Starting with the liberal perspective, a major liberal argument of preventing war is to promote trade and commerce. They argue that the interdependence among societies, among nations, can actually put war at bay. And these interdependence among people, among businessmen, among politicians, these can push statesmen or compel statesmen not to take any kind of measure that leads to war. We can look at the example of China and US relationship. It's a very tense relationship, although there is no war between them, particularly because China and US trade is of extreme importance to both the countries. Even with China, we see we have some important trade relations, and that's why, according to the liberal logic, that it cannot or it will never become a war. Next argument, what liberals provide, that arms control and diplomacy is having some capability to prevent war. Neoliberals, they particularly argue that there should be some intergovernmental or transnational bodies that will encourage talks, that will promote peace, and that will foster people-to-people connection. It can include tourism, it can include gastro-diplomacy, it can contribute towards P2P contacts, that is people-to-people contacts. So the relationship should not be confined within the realm of two foreign offices. If two nations become friends, then or they have good interactions, then war can be prevented. Functionalist theorists like David Mithrani argued that the creation of international agencies with limited and specific powers promote business, tourism, social and cultural exchanges, and that actually prevents war. We can look at the example of European Economic Council that later became EU. And if we look at the Second World War, it was basically the civil war of Europe in 1930s and 40s. Later, it became the most integrated region of the world. How did it become? The two conflicting parties, France and Germany, they somehow came into uh, uh, one platform, and they made an organization to promote business, trade, people to people exchange, and that became later an the most integrated region of the world. With these idea of intergovernmental agencies, the concept finally came of birth, like the institutions like League of Nations and UN. And in UN we see there are mechanisms that attempt to prevent war, and UN itself is the manifestation of the idea of collective security. It's not like UN under no circumstances talks about war. It talks about war only under special circumstances. Primarily, what UN talks about in their Article 33 of UN Charter, that there should be some measures to resolve conflict, and these are called the pacifist measures, like negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement. And if the two parties, they do not agree to any of these, the Security Council can request or advise two conflicting countries or one conflicting country to get engaged in this kind of peace mechanisms. These all have some limitations, like negotiation. We have seen that negotiation fails when somebody consider that negotiation is a zero sum game. If you agree with my terms, then I will think that, okay, then he is having some profit, so it's a loss for me, so I'll not get into this negotiation. Or if there is any aggrandizing party in this entire negotiation, like we have seen in Mahabharata, Duryodhan was not in favor of negotiation, even if he was offered the best deal possible by Sri Krishna. Only 5 villages he was asked, and he was not ready for it. So the point or the problem of negotiation is, if one party is not in favor of peace, then the entire peace, the idea of peace, breaks down, and it may lead to war. Next is this problem of inquiry, and the government or the state has finally the sovereignty to or not to accept the fact finding missions, their recommendations. So it's finally the question of sovereignty everywhere we find. In case of mediation, like we India, we do not allow any kind of mediation in case of Kashmir. It's our stand, it's our principle that we will resolve this issue. At the most, we can talk to Pakistan. Even if we consider it's a bilateral issue, sometimes we do not consider it as a bilateral issue. Jammu and Kashmir and the Pak-occupied Kashmir is a part and parcel of India's integrated region, so there is no point in talking to them. But largely, we do not encourage mediation. Many other countries in this world, they have established peace following these mediation. We have seen between Israel and Palestinians, there have been peace. Sometimes it's an interrupted peace, but nevertheless, there have been mediations by multiple agencies like US, sometimes by Norway, and many other countries. In case of judicial settlement, that problem also remains there, that the country, they will not finally abide by the verdict of the ICJ. these pacific settlements or these pacific measures, uh, well, they have some contributions, but it finally depends on the whims and fancy or the wishes of the state. So realists, they counter this argument and they say that finally this is the state who is going to admit these advices, or they are going to just disown or reject these proposals. So realists primarily argue that these suprastate actors, they cannot prevent war between two parties. It's most important for the state to take care of its own peace, preventing war, and since they are the security maximizer, they are the best agency to ensure these prevention of war. So how do they argue? This is very important. Realists, they argue just the opposite of the liberals so far as methods are concerned. But realists too, I categorically repeatedly mention that realists too, they are in favor of preventing war, but their methods are different, sometimes contradictory to liberals. Contradictory to liberals, they argue that these arms control is no good for the states. Realists argue that these trust or these focus on suprastate actors to ensure my peace or preventing war for a nation state is not an acceptable logic. They rather depend on the states as a security maximizer to prevent war. And they argue that world is in a shape of anarchy. There is no higher authority than state whatsoever. It may be UN, it may be you, or whatever agency. They cannot question or they cannot override the sovereignty of the state. So this is finally the state that has to ensure peace or that has to prevent war for itself. So how can they do it? They argue that prevention of war is the best policy, but they do not accept the liberal logic of these suprastate agencies or cutting down defense budgets or arms control, anything like this. They rather argue or discard this logic, and they argue that it's the state or the world is in a position of anarchy, and still there is no relentless war. The question is why? There is no war, relentless war at least, particularly because of the mechanism of balance of power. A country or a nation state, whenever it strengthens itself, it's countered by another country. So this is how peace is maintained or balance of power is maintained. And this balance of power, according to the realists, is very important for peace in the globe. Defensive realists, although they somehow accept the logic of these contract agreement to peace or whatsoever, but they also believe that this is the durability is not beyond questions. Whenever there is an aggrandizing power, these contracts or agreements will break down. And offensive realists, they on the other hand argue that these arms control, limiting of defense budget, these are like inviting your aggrandizing enemy to attack your country. So realists, they argue that this is most important to depend on the logic of deterrence. Now what is deterrence? Deterrence is the message that if one aggrandizing enemy attacks me, I am ready to fight back with a larger magnitude. So it's better for you not to attack me. This is the tactic or this is the logic of deterrence. So states, instead of arms control, they should depend on or they should believe in arms race. Always they have to be one step ahead of their aggrandizing or neighbors or other countries that can be your possible threat. Arms control, according to them, is an empty idea or often a sham, because there is no guarantee that your enemy is also following the principles of arms control. So realists, they argue that you must carry on with arming yourself, even if you are not aiming somebody, but you have to arm yourself. And defense and national security has no essential conflict with the idea of peace. You can be both committed to peace as well as take care of your national security. And that is why Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the former Prime Minister of our country, he always said that we are committed to both Shakti and Shanti. The words of Shanti is never acceptable from a country which is not powerful enough, which is not capable to take care of its own national security. So according to the realists, you have to take care of your defense upgradation in order to prevent war. Now we'll move on to the question of how terrorism can be stopped. A major obstacle towards stopping terrorism is there is no globally accepted definition of terrorism, and we are often confused that what is terrorism and what is not. We consider that yes, there is a bomb blast, so it's a terrorist activity. But what about uh, spreading radical literatures in cyberspace? What about terror funding? What about sympathizing or justifying terrorist activities? These are not terrorist activities. I mean, where to put an end? What is terrorism and what is not? Unless West was affected with the menace of terrorism, particularly at the time of 9/11, we did not consider, or global academia did not consider it as terrorism. We in India were suffering from the menace for last 50 years, and then the West-centric academia and the so-called global society, the global civil society, they said it's a law and order problem, somehow connected with your political issues in your country. But when they are affected with it, particularly US and Western Europe, in today's world they are one of the worst victims of terrorism. Now they call it terrorism. Yet there is no globally accepted and sanctioned definition of terrorism. So one thing we understand, that terrorism is not a law and order problem. It's not just a law and order problem. So we cannot prevent terrorism, or we cannot stop terrorism by preventing or taking care of law and order means. It's like treating the cancer with a band-aid. You have just a police force or rapid action forces and you are sending them doing some lathi charge. This is not how terrorism can be tackled. This is not how terrorism could be tackled anywhere in the globe. So what is done? Realists and liberals and the Marxists, they differ on these points. Realism considers that terrorism is a part of fourth generation warfare. This is war by another means, particularly by the weaker nations. And since it's a part of the, or it's a continuation of the warfare, we must deal terrorism through military means. There is no other way. So unilateral crackdown on terrorists is something what they prescribe. Realists argue that states and non-state actors are not two different identities. So the militaristic means must be adapted against both of them. And the forces must be upgraded, developed through traditional military or police forces. You cannot deal with modern day warfare like terrorism. You have to have sales or upgraded troops that can deal with modern day warfare like urban warfare, and we need to upgrade these conventional forces to fight the non-conventional warfare. So this is an absolutely militaristic approach, and and it is an approach that talks about countering terrorist, not just countering terrorism. These are openly countering terrorist. But neoliberals, they argue that no, this is something that can be counterproductive, and neoliberals argue that you need to negotiate with these people, the so-called terrorists who were sometimes called militants, and their rights, their dignity is very important, and you need to establish the democratic means to include these people. You just cannot send a combat troop and crack down upon them. It's more important to include them, be a inclusive state, then only this problem of terrorism can be solved. Strengthening socio-economic political institutions can help in eradication of the grievances of the people, then only terrorism can be solved. They also argue the importance of global institutions, global civil society, that can take care of the grievances of these so-called suppressed people. And when they are recognized globally, their problems are acknowledged globally, then only these grievances can be ventilated and the problem of terrorism can be solved. So, following these arguments, the Al Qaeda cannot be defeated, as we have seen, unless democratic values take roots in that country. And we have seen that right the moment US decided to withdraw its troop, and Al Qaeda recaptured the country, particularly because the democratic values that the US Army or the country US or the Western powers were fighting for a long time in Afghanistan could not be established, and the rise of terrorism we can find. Marxists have a completely different take on it. They argue that terrorism cannot be countered with these militaristic means or these so-called liberal means. These are reactions against the oppression of the developed countries upon the developing nations. So unless these inequality in treating them is completely withdrawn, terrorism will be there, and there is no way to counter it. But this is not how actually we see the states like US, Israel, India, who are affected completely by terrorism. This is not how they actually practically combat terrorists. Ideally, they accept both the logic, and they accept the fact that we need to crack down upon the terrorist, and also we need to include the people who are affected, whose dignity is at stake, and who are part and parcel of our society. So you cannot actually kill everyone and say that now there will be no insurgency. Even the last man killed, the last insurgent who is killed, there will be insurgency after that. So the states practically, they are not theoretical enough to follow one particular line of the theorist. They attempt a combined approach, and what do? They look at the problem of terrorism from four perspectives. One is structural, next is instrumental, third is organizational, and last but not the least is psychological. Primarily, to counter the structural cause, they get engaged with the terrorist groups in a negotiation and offer them to surrender and to cooperate. And what happens? It somehow reduces their credibility among the militants. So if they surrender, it is fine. And if they do not surrender, they somehow lose their support base. We have seen it happened in case of PLO. The second generation terrorist groups that we have found in against Israel, like Hamas, they are horribly against PLO, and they consider, or they claim that PLO is nothing but an agent of US or Israel. So you see, you need to cut off these people from their public support or the mass support. At the instrumental level, you need to take care of, or the countries take care for border fencing, commando training, targeted killing, precise assassination, joint patrolling, protecting public places where terrorist activities can take place. At the organizational level, they somehow create new, more and more channels for venting the grievances of these people who are somehow being represented, or at least claimed to be represented by these terrorist groups. And finally, you need to knock at their mind. Psychologically, you need to defeat them. So the state always gives this message that we are a better and superior force. I can kill you at any point of time. And this is how sometimes terrorists, they surrender. And somehow their so-called struggle is becomes weak. So, what we can conclude is that this hard line and soft line both together works. It's not like either of these way. The states practically combined both these way. They militarily counter these so-called terrorists or the militants. They knock down upon them, kill them, and on the other hand, they develop the societies. Like we have seen, the present Indian government is investing a lot in Jammu and Kashmir for their development. And many other countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, they are also investing towards the development of the Jammu and Kashmir state, so that cinema halls can be built, better roadways can be built, there can be amusement parks and everything, so that people get engaged in everyday life and they can celebrate life. This is very important in countering terrorism. Otherwise, counter-terrorism can be counterproductive, and this invisible level of engaging the societies with the mainstream society is very important. And what we see in India's approach, there is a sea change. Earlier, we used to counter the menace of terrorism with a law and order approach. We are sending our troops, we are sending our police force, primarily police force, and the states that used to take care. But later, with the 2611, we have seen that we have NSG, we have different instruments, we have upgraded law in 2018 that talks about not just the institutions but also the individuals which can be considered as terrorists. So legally, financially, we are cracking down on the terror funding. So financially, legally, socially, and militarily, that we have seen in surgical strikes, that we will do all this, but will not give up the policy of cracking down on militaries, even if they are coming from another country. So cross-border terrorism too will be dealt militarily. So we are somehow adopting an inclusive approach towards countering terrorism. But one mistake we must not do, that we expect that one day there will be no terrorist. This is not how statesmanship works. This is not how statecraft works. It's sometimes taking time, sometimes it's managing the conflict, but absolutely a peaceful world, there will be everything will be fine. This is not really expected in the domain of international relations. We have to be pragmatic enough to accept the realities or the vagaries of the politics.